Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, my spiritual master, his Advent day today.
We want the evening, not the morning. We want the evening.
Very big chemical content.
This is the evening where you're talking. Okay, fantastic.
One of my friends is still living, Sri Narendranath Malik. He informed me that one saintly person has come. Let us go and see. At that time I was a young man and I did not care for very much about so-called saintly persons, because in our house my father used to receive so many sannyasis, but some of them were not very to the standard, and due to my association with college friends, younger days, I lost my faith practically. Although I was born in a Vaishnava family, my father was a pure Vaishnava. From my childhood, he gave me Hare Krishna deity for worshipping. And also, I was playing with my boyfriend, Rathayatra, those like that. My father encouraged. So I was trained up in this line, but in my youthful days, when I was college student, gradually, either bad association or something, gradually I lost my activities. But when this friend, Mr. Malik, took me to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, he immediately asked me that you are educated young boy, why don't you take up Lord Chaitanya's message and preach in the Western world? And a very fast sight, he told me. At that time, I argued with him that we are dependent nation and who is going to hear about our message. So, he repeated my argument. There is no necessity of closing. He repeated my argument. He was a learned scholar, what I was able to study for. So, he agreed that I was defeated. So, after finishing our visit with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, I got some impression that here is a person who has taken Lord Chaitanya's message very seriously. Now it will be preached. My friend asked my opinion. He said, what is your opinion? So I gave this opinion, that here is a person who has taken Lord Chaitanya's movement very seriously, and now it will be preached. So that was in 1922. Then, in 1923, I left Calcutta on business account, and I started my business at Allahabad. But I was always thinking of my Guru Maharaj, although I was that time not initiated, but the impression was there. I was thinking, I met a very nice, saintly person. So, in this way, I passed from 1923 to 1928, I think. then during Kumbh Mela, stop that noise, isn't it? In 1928, my Guru Maharaj, along with other disciples, came to Allahabad for starting their branch there. So some gentleman known to me might have told them that the proprietor of such and such business, Prayas Pharmacy, is a very nice gentleman. He can help you in so many ways. So they came to me, and I saw the same saintly persons whom I met 1922. I was very glad to receive. In this way, my connection was more intimate with my Guru Maharaj. And in 1936, 1933, I was initiated officially. Although I was initiated in 1922, but officially I was initiated in 1933. Although from 1922 to 1933, I was always thinking of His Divine Grace, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj. So in 1936, he was to pass away by 31st December. So I do not know, out of my own accord, I wrote him one letter that Guru Maharaj, you have got many disciples, some of you are directly serving you. I could not do so. I am a householder. So if you give me some direct service to you, it will be very kind of. So he replied that letter that you try to preach in English language, then the persons will be instructed by you, and both yourself will be benefited. Again, he said the same thing which he ordered me in 1922 at the first sight. Then he passed away in 1936, 31st December. Then there are other God brothers. I consulted him that Guru Maharaj said like this, what can I do? So they also encouraged me. I was writing, there was a paper, harmonist. Then by their desires I started this Back to Godhead in 1944. That was also started on his Advent Day, this Advent Day. Back to Godhead was started. Yes. There was a meeting and many friends came and we first started this Back to Godhead on his Advent Day. This Advent Day, 1944. So our paper Back to Godhead, the Advent Day is also today. Yes. Yes. So at that time there was no sale of Back to Godhead. I was publishing about 1,000 copies and distributing. So there was no income. I was spending 300, 400 rupees from my pocket. At that time I had income. Then gradually I wanted to remain as a grihastha and priest, but Guru Maharaj did not like this idea. I could understand. Sometime I was dreaming that he was calling me, and I was horrified that I'll have to go away from home. So, at last, it happened so that I left my home in 1950 and became a Banaprastha. I was living sometimes here and there. In 1959, I took sannyas. But that back to Godhead was going on. Then there was some inner dictation that these papers back to Godhead I am publishing, people are taking. Some friend advised me that why don't you write some books? That will be nice. So then I began to translate Srimad Bhagavatam. And because I left home, so practically I had no income. With this Bhagavatam, back to Godhead, I was selling and I was somewhere or other maintaining. And whatever little money I had, that was finished. And then when I wrote book, Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto was finished, so I approached Bhaiji, Paras Mataji, no, 1962. So I asked him that you take this publication. I am very much obliged to Bhaiji. He said that our English printing is not very efficient. You can get this book published somewhere else. I shall partly help you. So he helped me with some money from the Dalmia Trust, and I first of all published my first part of Srimad Bhagavatam. Then I published second part also. There was sale. Then there was no necessity of money. I was getting money by selling Srimad Bhagavatam. Everyone appreciated. In your American embassy here, they purchased 18 copies and they gave me open order that whenever this Bhagavad will be published, next part, subsequent part, this is open order, 18 copies, each part. That order is still there. So after publishing 3 parts, completing, then automatically Guru Maharaj gave me indication that now you can start for America. So somewhere around in 1965, I went to America with great difficulty. But I took about 200 sets of books. The custom clearance was done. I told them that I am taking this book for distribution, not for sale. Anyway, they passed. And with these books, I reached America, and I was maintaining myself by selling these books for 1 year. There was no friend, and I was living in an apartment and with great difficulty. Still, the whole, I want to say, stock and my typewriter, my table, everything was stolen. In this way, I became very much depressed. And I was going to the shipping company when the next ship is going to India. They gave me such and such day. Then I thought, let me wait for some time more, then I shall return back. I had returned ticket, of course. There was no difficulty. In this way, 1966, by selling this book, I had only $200, and I dared to take one apartment and storefront $125 per month and apartment $75. So I had only $200. So I advanced in $200. I did not know how to pay next month's rent. So I started in 1966 lecturing in a storefront, living in that apartment in 26 2nd Avenue. Then gradually these boys, American boys and girls, began to come, and then I started my kirtan in Tompkinson Square. More and more, these young Americans, they came to me, and things were organized. Then I registered this Krishna Consciousness Society under Religious Act of New York in 1966, and gradually people took interest.
Hare Krishna. Okay. We shall call our society ISKCON, Prabhupada laughed playfully when he first coined the acronym. He had initiated the legal work of incorporating that spring while still living on the Bowery. But even before the legal beginning, he had begun talking about his International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And so it appeared in the letters to India and in the Village Voice. A friend had suggested a title that would be more familiar to Westerners. International Society for God Consciousness. But Prabhupada had insisted Krishna consciousness. God was a vague term, whereas Krishna was exact and scientific. God consciousness was spiritually weaker, less personal. And if Westerners didn't know that Krishna was God, then the International Society for Krishna Consciousness would tell them by spreading his glories, Krishna's glories, in every town and village. Krishna consciousness was Prabhupada's own rendering of a phrase from Srila Rupa Goswami's Padyavali, written in the 16th century. Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavita. To be absorbed in the mellow taste of executing devotional service to Krishna. But to register ISKCON legally as a non-profit, tax-exempt religion required money and a lawyer. Carl Jurgens had already gained some experience in forming religious, political, or social welfare groups, and when he met Prabhupada in the Bowery, he'd agreed to help. He'd contacted his lawyer, Stephen Goldsmith. Stephen Goldsmith, a young Jewish lawyer with a wife and 2 children, had an office on Park Avenue. But he was interested in spiritual movements. When Carl told him about Srila Prabhupada's plan, he immediately was fascinated by the idea of setting up a religious incorporation for an Indian Swami. He visited Prabhupada, 26 2nd Avenue, and they discussed incorporation, tax exemption, Prabhupada's immigration status, and Krishna consciousness. Mr. Goldsmith visited Prabhupada several times. Once he brought his children, who liked the soup that Swami had cooked. Dal? I don't know, I guess. He began attending the evening lectures, where he was often the only non-hippie member of the congregation. He would come in his suit and tie, Mukunda told me. One evening, the rest were just like it even had clothes on. One evening, having completed all the legal groundwork and being ready to complete the procedure for incorporation, Mr. Goldsmith came to Srila Prabhupada's evening lecture and kirtan to get signatures from the trustees of the new society. July 11th, Prabhupada's lecturing. Mr. Goldsmith, wearing slacks, a shirt, and a tie, sits on the floor near the door listening earnestly to the lecture, despite the distracting noise of the neighborhood. You hear those tapes, trucks going by, dogs barking, little kids screaming and running, Brahmananda chasing after them, threatening them. Prabhupada has explained how scholars mislead innocent people with non-devotional interpretations of Bhagavad Gita. And now, in recognition of the attorney's respectable presence, as if to catch Mr. Goldsmith's attention better, he introduced him into the subject of the talk. Prabhupada was just an expert lecturer, you know. You mention the person's name, you mention their history, then they wake right up, you know. I will give you a practical example of how things are misinterpreted. Just like our president, Mr. Goldsmith. He knows that expert lawyers, by interpretation, can do many things. When I was in Calcutta, there was a rent tax passed by the government, and some expert lawyer changed the whole thing by his interpretation. The government had to reenact the whole law because their purpose was foiled by the interpretation of this lawyer. So we are not for this foiling the purpose of Krishna, for which the Bhagavad Gita was spoken. But unauthorized persons are trying to foil the purpose of Krishna, therefore that is unauthorized. All right, Mr. Goldsmith, you can ask anything. Mr. Goldsmith stands, and to the surprise of the people gathered, he makes a short announcement asking for signers on an incorporation document for Swami's new religious movement. Prabhupada, they are here. You can take the addresses now. Mr. Goldsmith, I can take them now? Yes. Prabhupada, yes, you can. Bill, you can give your address. And Raphael, you can give yours. And Don, Roy, Mr. Green. As the meeting breaks up, those called on to sign as trustees come forward, standing around the little storefront, waiting to leave cursorily, just skim the things. Standing around, there it is, through the pages of the lawyer had produced from his thin attaché case, and to sign as he directs. Yet not a soul amongst them is committed to Krishna consciousness. Mr. Goldsmith meets his quota of signers, a handful of sympathizers, with enough respect for the Swami to want to help him. The first trustees, who will hold office for a year, quote, until the first annual meeting of the corporation, end quote, are Michael Grant, who puts his name and address without ever reading the document. Of course, we all know who Michael Grant is. The great hero Mukunda Prabhu. Mike's girlfriend Jan, who became Janaki, and James Green. No one seriously intends to undertake any formal duties as trustees of the religious society, but they're happy to help the Swami by signing his fledgling society into legal existence. According to law, the second group of trustees will assume office for the second year. They are Paul Gardner, Roy, who later on was Ramananda Roy, or Ray Ram, and Don, who I think was Damodar. Maybe. The trustees for the third year are Carl Yagan, Bill Epstein, and Raphael, who I don't know. None of them know exactly what the half-dozen legal-sized type pages mean, except that Swami's forming a society. Why? For tax exemption, in case anyone ever gives a big donation. I mean, that was like, what are the chances of that happening? And for other benefits an official religious society might receive. But these purposes hardly seem urgent or even relevant to the present situation. Who's going to make a donation? Except for Mr. Goldsmith, who has any money. But Prabhupada is planning for the future, and he's planning for much more than just tax exemption. He is trying to serve his spiritual predecessors and fulfill the spiritual prediction of a spiritual movement that is to flourish for 10,000 years in the midst of the age of Kali. Within the vast age of Kali, a period of 432,000 years, the 1960s are but an insignificant moment. The Vedas describe that the time of the universe revolves around a cycle of 4 seasons or yugas, and Kali Yuga is the worst of them all, in which all spiritual qualities of men diminish until humanity is finally reduced to a bestial civilization devoid of human decency. However, the Vedic literature foretells of a golden age of spiritual life. Prabhupada says like you have a river. The river is going one way, but every now and then you get a cross current, an eddy going the other way. So everything's going to hell in a handbasket in the age of Kali. But for Prabhupada said 5,000 years up, 5,000-year plateau, beginning from the appearance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. There's a renaissance, a spiritual renaissance. Not everywhere. Prabhupada said in pockets. It's not everywhere. Prabhupada said there's birds and birds and crows, swans and crows. So where the devotees gather becomes nicer and nicer, more like Satyuga, and where the karmis are, it becomes worse and worse. It's not everywhere. Oh, where were we? With a vision that, this is one of Satsur Maharaj's great sentences, with a vision that soars off to the end of the millennium and beyond, yet with his 2 feet solidly on the ground at 2nd Avenue, Prabhupada has begun an international society for Krishna consciousness. He has many practical responsibilities, paying the rent, incorporating society, paving the way for a thriving worldwide congregation of devotees. Yet he doesn't see his humble beginnings as limiting the greater scope of his divine mission. He knows that everything depends on Krishna, so whether he succeeds or fails, it's up to the Supreme. He has only to try. We just have 2 more pages. The purposes stated within ISKCON's Articles of Incorporation reveal Prabhupada's thinking. They were 7 points, similar to those given to the prospectus of the League of Devotees he'd formed in Jhansi, India, in 1953. That attempt had been unsuccessful. He was chased out by the Women's League, I think, wasn't it? The wife of the mayor. Yet his purposes remained unchanged. 7, this is reading from the incorporation, 7 purposes of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. A, to systematically propagate spiritual knowledge to society at large and to educate people in the techniques of spiritual life in order to check the imbalance of values in life and to achieve real unity and peace in the world. B, to propagate a consciousness of Krishna as it is revealed in the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. C, to bring the members of the society together with each other and nearer to Krishna, the prime entity, thus to develop the idea within the members and humanity at large that each soul is part and parcel of the quality of Godhead Krishna. D, to teach and encourage the Sankirtan movement, congregational chanting of the holy name of God as revealed in the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. E, to erect for the members and society at large a holy place of transcendental pastimes dedicated to the personality of Krishna. Now, on one hand, that's all the temples, but what else is Prabhupada talking about? Well, I was thinking Mayapur, actually, but he was thinking New Vrindavan. That's it. New Vrindavan, which happened. To bring the members, to bring the members closer for the purpose of teaching a simpler and more natural way of life, and G, with a view towards achieving the aforementioned purposes, to publish and distribute periodicals, magazine, books, and other writings. Those are the 7 purposes. Regardless of what ISKCON's charter members thought of the Society's purposes, Srila Prabhupada saw them as imminent realities. As Mr. Rubin, the subway conductor, had met Prabhupada on a Manhattan park bench in 1965, had noted, quote, he seemed to know that he would have temples filled up with devotees. Prabhupada said to him, there will be temples and there will be books. They are existing. They are there. But time is separating us from them. That's what he told Mr. Rubin on the park bench in 1965. Prabhupada, Mukunda said Prabhupada had him print letterhead that said, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, temples around the world. All they had was the storefront. He's thinking temples around, all right, you know. The first purpose mentioned in the charter was propagation. Quote, preaching was the word Prabhupada most often used. For him, preaching was a much broader significance than merely sermonizing. Preaching meant glorious, selfless adventures on behalf of the Supreme Lord. Lord Chaitanya had preached by walking all over the southern India and causing thousands of people to chant and dance with him in ecstasy. Lord Krishna had preached Bhagavad Gita while standing with Arjuna in his chariot on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Lord Buddha had preached, Lord Jesus had preached, and all pure devotees preach. ISKCON's preaching would achieve what the League of Nations and the United Nations had failed to achieve, quote, real unity and peace in the world, end quote. ISKCON workers would bring peace to a world deeply afflicted by materialism and strife. Like they took Prabhupada to, was it a silent vigil in front of the United Nations? And then I think the devotees started chanting, but who knows? Oh, they shut up. But the point is that the Prabhupada nailed it. He said all they're doing is increasing the number of flags. Where's the United Nation, you know? What's that? Disunited. Yeah, it's just, you know. Okay. They would, quote, systematically propagate spiritual knowledge, end quote, knowledge of the non-sectarian science of God. It was not that a new religion was being born on July of 1966. Rather, the eternal preaching of Godhead, known as Sankirtan, will be transplanted from east to west. The society's members would join together, and by hearing the teachings of Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and by chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, they would come to realize that each was a spirit soul eternally related to Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. They would then preach to, quote, humanity at large, end quote, especially through Sankirtan, the chanting of the holy name of God. And they used to go out with Hayagriva playing his trumpet, and somehow or other they had one of those big drums, you know, like you used to see in a circus, boom, boom. I don't know what they call those things, you know, a big, not a kettle drum, the kind that they used to wear around their neck, and it's circular and boom, boom, like a big circus. They would go out with that big circus drum and Hayagriva on trumpet. Just imagine the scene. We've come a long way. Okay. ISKCON, only 3 paragraphs. ISKCON would also erect a holy place of transcendental pastimes dedicated to the personality of Krishna. Was this something beyond the storefront? Yes, certainly. He never thought small. Prabhupada said, what was Prabhupada's disease? I cannot think small. That's what he said his disease was. And it's a fact. He wanted ISKCON to, where was it? ISKCON would erect a holy place of transcendental pastimes dedicated to the personality of Godhead. Was this something beyond the storefront? Yes, certainly. He never thought small. He seemed to know that he would have temples filled up with devotees. He wanted ISKCON to demonstrate, quote, a simple, more natural way of life, end quote. Such a life, Prabhupada thought of the villages in India where people lived just as Krishna had lived, end quote, was most conducive to developing Krishna consciousness. And all 6 purposes will be achieved by the 7th. ISKCON would publish and distribute literature. That was the specific instruction of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had given to Prabhupada. He had specifically told him one day in 1932 at Radhakund in Vrindavan, if you ever, quote, if you ever get money, publish books, end quote. Certainly none of the signers saw any immediate shape to Prabhupada's dream, to Swamiji's dream. Yet these 7 purposes were not simply theistic rhetoric invented to convince a New York State government official to sign the papers for tax exemption. Prabhupada meant to enact every item in the charter. Of course, he was now working in extremely limited circumstances. Quote, this is from the articles. The principal place of worship, located at 26 2nd Avenue in the city, county, and state of New York, end quote, was the sole headquarters for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Yet Prabhupada insisted that he was not living on 26 2nd Avenue in New York City. His vision was transcendental. His Guru Maharaj had gone out from the transcendental holy place of spiritual meditation to preach in cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Delhi. Yet Srila Prabhupada, you know that he had a train, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had 2 trains, and those trains would crisscross all over India, and they would stop within an hour. They could set up all kinds of displays, at the main stops where they'd stop for a couple hours. They'd set up a whole set of displays and exhibits, book table, prasadam, preach for a couple hours, pack the whole thing up, and move to the next city. 2 trains traveling, crisscrossing all over India. Oh, fantastic stuff. That's in that biography by Bhakti Vikas Maharaj. Okay, where are we? And yet Prabhupada would say that his spiritual master had not really been living in any of those cities, but was always in Vaikuntha, the spiritual world, because of his absorption in devotional service. Last paragraph. Similarly, the place of worship, 26 2nd Avenue, was not a New York storefront, a former curiosity shop. The storefront and the apartment had been spiritualized and were now a transcendental haven. Quote, society at large, end quote, would come here. The whole world would take shelter here, regardless of race or religion. Plain, small, and impoverished as it was, Prabhupada regarded the storefront as, quote, a transcendental place, a holy place of transcendental pastimes dedicated to the personality of God, end quote. It was a world headquarters, a publishing house, a sacred place of pilgrimage, and a center from which an army of devotees would issue forth and chant the holy name of God in all the streets of the world. The entire universe would receive Krishna consciousness from the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which was beginning here today. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. We'll end there. I'm not going to add a purport because I think he ends it perfectly. All right, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.